They tell you that the greatest tragedy of old age is dying alone. They say it's the shadow that haunts every man once he crosses 70. But I am 81 years old, and I have spent the last decade uncovering a truth that most people are too terrified to even whisper. For 3 years, I lived what the world calls the perfect life. I had a partner who cared for me, a son who cheered for me, and a house filled with the constant humming sound of conversation. And in those 3 years, I became a ghost in my own skin. I didn't realize it then, but the day I invited someone in to cure my loneliness was the day I began to execute the man I actually was. I'm going to tell you something that might sound cold or even bitter, but I promise you it is the most honest thing I could ever share, because there is something far more dangerous than an empty house. There is a specific kind of death that happens when you let other people define what your peace should look like. And if you're not careful, you might spend the best years of your remaining time trying to fix a life that wasn't actually broken. They tell you that the greatest tragedy of old age is dying alone. They say it's the shadow that haunts every man once he crosses 70. But I am 81 years old, and I have spent the last decade uncovering a truth that most people are too terrified to even whisper. For 3 years, I lived what the world calls the perfect life. I had a partner who cared for me, a son who cheered for me, and a house filled with the constant humming sound of conversation. And in those 3 years, I became a ghost in my own skin. I didn't realize it then, but the day I invited someone in to cure my loneliness was the day I began to execute the man I actually was. I'm going to tell you something that might sound cold or even bitter, but I promise you it is the most honest thing I could ever share, because there is something far more dangerous than an empty house. There is a specific kind of death that happens when you let other people define what your peace should look like. And if you're not careful, you might spend the best years of your remaining time trying to fix a life that wasn't actually broken. Before everything changed, my life was a symphony of small, deliberate sounds. I was a restorer of rare books. For 45 years, I lived in a world made of gold leaf, rabbit skin glue, and the faint vanilla scent of decaying paper. People think books are about information, but they aren't. They are about preservation. They are about the rhythm of the hand. My wife, Martha, understood this better than anyone. We were married for 41 years, and our marriage was built on a foundation of shared silence. We could sit in the same room for 4 hours, her knitting and me cleaning a 16th century spine, without saying a single word. It wasn't because we had nothing to say, it was because we didn't need words to bridge the gap. We were already there, together, in the quiet. When Martha passed away in the autumn of 2015, the world expected me to collapse. She went peacefully, sliding away in her sleep like a bookmark falling out of a favorite novel. The house felt massive afterward, yes. The kitchen was too quiet. The bed was too large. For the first year, I wandered through the rooms like a man looking for his glasses in the dark. But then I found my grounding. I moved my entire life into the basement. I built a sanctuary. I installed specialized lighting that mimicked the soft, indirect glow of a museum. I organized my bone folders, my paring knives, and my weights. By the time I hit 75, I had a routine that was cast in iron. 6 a.m., the whistle of the kettle. 6:15 a.m., coffee on the back porch, watching the fog roll off the woods. 7 a.m., the first touch of the squirrel hair brush on a tattered page. It was a life of absolute precision. It was a life where I felt every nerve in my fingertips. I wasn't lonely. I was present. I was the master of my own time. And for the first time since the funeral, I could breathe. The problem with being content in the dark is that it makes the people who live in the light very uncomfortable. My son, Julian, is a good man. He is a man of noise, of doing, of constant movement. To him, my basement was a tomb. To him, my silence was a symptom of a disease that needed a cure. At Thanksgiving, he sat across from me, and I could see the pity vibrating in his eyes. He looked at my hands, stained with old paste, and he saw a tragedy. "Dad," he said, "you're fading. You're becoming a hermit. You spend 10 hours a day down there talking to dead authors. You need a reason to shave. You need a reason to come upstairs." I tried to explain to him that the silence wasn't a hole I was falling into. It was a mountain I was climbing. I tried to tell him that a man who can sit with himself for 10 hours without a television is the only truly free man on earth. But he wasn't listening. He was fixing me. A few months later, he introduced me to Clara. She was 65, a retired school teacher, sharp-witted, kind, and exactly as alone as the world thought I was. I made a mistake that winter. I listened to the consensus. My neighbor, my son, my old colleagues, they all spoke with one voice. "Life is for the living, Elias. Don't waste your final years in a basement." I started to doubt my own happiness. I wondered if my contentment was actually just a clever mask for a deep, hidden depression. So I opened the door. I let Clara in. I let the world in. For the first few months, I was a star of a movie I didn't write. Everyone was so relieved. Julian called more often. My neighbors stopped giving me those pity smiles at the mailbox. I took Clara to dinners. I learned the names of her grandchildren. I practiced the art of the 8 a.m. conversation. And let me be clear, Clara was wonderful. She was warm, she was interesting, and she looked at me with a genuine affection that I hadn't felt since Martha. But there was a price, a presence tax on my soul that I didn't notice I was paying until the bill became too high. Clara was a morning processor. She woke up with 10,000 words ready to be spoken. By the time I had my first sip of coffee, she was analyzing the news, planning the weekend, and asking me what I was thinking about. I am a man who needs 2 hours of silence just to calibrate my heart for the day. But in the interest of being a good partner, I gave those hours away. I traded my porch meditation for morning check-ins. Then came the basement. She never told me to stop my work. In fact, she encouraged it, but she wanted to be part of it. She would come down at 10 a.m. with a tray of iced tea. She would stand over my shoulder while I was trying to align a delicate piece of gold leaf, a task that requires you to hold your breath so the metal doesn't blow away. "What are you working on today, Elias?" she'd ask. "Is that tool dangerous? Why do you use that smelly glue?" They weren't cruel questions. They were acts of love. But every time the basement door creaked open, the flow was shattered. The deep meditative state where I lost track of my age, my aches, and my mortality, it vanished. I was no longer an artist. I was a performer with an audience. I started going to the basement earlier, at 5 a.m., just to beat her to the morning. Then she started waking up earlier to surprise me with coffee. It was a race toward a finish line I didn't want to cross. The breaking point didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a cold cup of coffee and a shaking hand. One Tuesday morning in April, I woke up at 5:30. The house was quiet for a moment. I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard, and I realized I didn't want to go downstairs. I felt a heavy, leaden dread in my chest. I realized that the workshop no longer felt like my sanctuary. It felt like a stage where I was waiting for my co-star to arrive. I had stopped taking on the big, complex restoration projects, the ones that take months of solitary focus. I was just making safe things, small repairs, things that could be interrupted without ruin. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I didn't recognize the man looking back. He looked tired, not from the work, but from the constant effort of being available. I had shrunk my universe to fit inside a relationship. I had traded my rhythm for her melody. Inasmuch as I liked her melody, it wasn't mine. I had allowed the world to convince me that my solitude was a problem to be solved, rather than a gift to be protected. I ended things 2 weeks later. It was the hardest conversation of my life because she had done nothing wrong. I told her the truth. I am a man who belongs to the silence, Clara, and I've been asking you to live in a room that doesn't have enough air for both of us. The day after she moved out, the house felt massive again. It felt cavernous. I woke up at 5:30. I made my coffee. I sat on the back porch. The silence was so heavy, I could almost feel it on my skin. And for the first time in 1,000 days, the weight in my chest was gone. I walked into the basement. I didn't pick up a tool. I just put my palms flat on the workbench. I breathed in the scent of sawdust, old oil, and rabbit skin glue. I stood there until the sun was high in the sky. I wasn't waiting for anyone to, check on me. I wasn't worried about being, too quiet. I was Elias again. I am 81 now. Julian still worries. My neighbors still think I'm a, lone wolf. But they are looking through a window that doesn't see the whole room. I want you to hear this, especially if you feel the pressure to, find someone, or, get back out there because you're a certain age. Connection is a beautiful thing, but it is not the only thing. If you are a person who finds their soul in the quiet, in the craft, or in the long, lonely walks at dawn, do not let the world tell you that you are broken. There is a fear in our culture of, dying alone. We are told it is the ultimate tragedy. But I have lived through the alternative, and I am telling you, with the clarity of a man who can see the end of the road, dying alone is just a moment. But living your life as a stranger to yourself, that is a slow, daily tragedy that lasts for years. My basement is currently filled with the pieces of an 18th century atlas. It's a mess of torn maps and crumbling leather. It takes all my focus. It demands my silence. Sometimes I look at the chair where Clara used to sit, and I feel a twinge of what people call loneliness. But then I feel the paper under my hands. I hear the rhythm of the house. I feel the absolute freedom of my own time. And I realize the coffee might be cold, but for the first time, the man drinking it is finally, completely alive. Don't be afraid of the quiet. Be afraid of the noise that makes you forget who you are. It is enough. I promise you, it is enough.